Hi, Etcher followers, and welcome to another installment. Today, we're going to be talking about retaining walls, and we're very privileged to have online with us Philip Nell, the founder of NABA. He's a structural engineer, and we thought it's best to actually have a professional answer the questions that we always ponder about in terms of retaining walls. Please welcome Philip. Thank you for joining us. We've got a couple of questions, and I think a lot of the viewers would just really want to know, what is a retaining wall? Would you be able to help us with that?
Yes, perfect. Thanks, Mike and Candice, for inviting us. So just quickly, I'm Philip Nell. I'm a structural engineer. So I hope I can answer your questions correctly. So the first question is, what is a retaining wall? So if you look at this, I'm going to just show you some images because it's easier to understand it. And this is from the SNS codes. So that's where I got this, and you can get this and purchase it online. So a retaining wall, this is the definition here, a wall that's intended to resist lateral displacement of materials. So lateral displacement means horizontal movement. So it has to prevent, this is the fill of material behind the wall. So that's your wall here. And the green is the fill of material. So that wall, this one here, needs to prevent this stuff behind it from moving laterally. That's essentially what it means. So it's any wall that needs to resist something to move laterally. That's behind it. I hope that makes sense. And you must also ask me if it doesn't, so I can explain it in more depth.
I'm going to ask completely from a layman's perspective. How do you actually know when a wall becomes a retaining wall? Because quite often in complex settings, you'll have a boundary wall, and then that ends up actually being a retaining wall. So how do you know, or how can you identify? How does it actually look?
No. So to explain it to you, a wall, so a general wall that's just standing there is called a freestanding wall. So that is something that looks like this. So that's your typical boundary wall or any type of wall really that you have where you have a foundation. And then on top of the foundation, you build your wall. So that's your wall. So now this is a freestanding wall. And because the earth on both sides are at the same level, that there and that there is at the same level, it's regarded as a freestanding wall. So that SNS regulation about walls says a freestanding wall and boundary wall shall be designed and constructed so that, and this is the important part, no earth is retained. So a boundary wall is only a boundary wall up to the point where it starts retaining soil. And what that means is when it retains something, it means that this height on the one side of earth is higher than the other side. So now, that's where it gets tricky because is 5 millimeters then retaining? And that's ridiculous because, one day the wind will blow, then the sand on the one side is lower than the other side. And so it can't change from being a retaining wall and not being a retaining. But that's where it gets tricky because there's nothing really that tells you now it is a retaining wall at this height. So to answer that question, you have to sort of delve a little bit deeper into the codes and understand it better. So, and this is probably the best place where you can find it. That is, I just want to see if I have an image on that, is where they talk about just foundation brickwork. So foundation brickwork is at the bottom of your building. How much soil you can put behind that wall, and what's acceptable, and when should you change the wall. So then you can look at the type of wall here and the maximum height of soil that can be behind it for it just to be a normal foundation wall. So that you can use that as a guideline for choose your wall type that you have, and then look at that height. And when you exceed that height, then it becomes a retaining wall. It's not set out like that in the code, but I think that's probably the best guidance that you can get to decide when is it becoming a retaining wall. And for this conversation's sake, the most standard walls that you get, boundary walls, are those two walls. So it's between 600 and 700 millimeters. If the difference is that much, then then it becomes a retaining wall.
Okay,
But like
I
I
was going to
say,
ask you.
that is my conclusion from the codes. And if you go and Google it and you research, you'll get a lot of different answers. And that's probably the most accurate conclusion. Well, that's my most accurate conclusion that I can make from the codes is between 600 and 700 millimeters for your standard 220, 230 brickwork wall that you get as a boundary wall. That's probably your trigger point to say, okay, now it becomes a retaining wall. And then we can go into a lot more detail about what type of retaining wall you need and how you design it based on the height and what you actually have.
So when we sometimes go to complexes and, they were established quite a few years ago, quite often it seems almost like the boundary walls have become a retaining wall over time. How does that actually happen? If it wasn't meant to be a retaining wall and then you visit this complex and you see, well, hang on
Yeah,
here, this is actually a retaining wall.
that
How does
yeah,
that
that
actually happen?
so that happens quite a lot when you have a neighbor and they start building and they want to make their earth more level on their side in order to make their construction process much easier. Then they would fill behind your wall. So then it actually becomes a retaining wall, and that then triggers a lot of issues, because typically it wouldn't have been designed to be a retaining wall, number one. They wouldn't have done subsoil drainage or weep holes through the wall or waterproofing behind the wall, stuff like that. So if that happens uncontrolled, there will definitely be issues.
Okay.
But
And
to answer your question, so why would it happen? Is because somebody wanted to create a platform on the other side of the wall or raise it or make it more level. And when does it become a retaining wall? That's the height difference that we just discussed.
okay. Is there or have there been changes on how retaining walls were built? Let's say if we have a scheme that was actually built around about the early 90s, and now you start to see retaining wall failure. Is there a lifespan on a retaining wall?
So, okay, I'm going to answer that sort of in two stages. The one question is, has there been changes in how retaining walls are built? And the answer there is yes, definitely. There has been changes, and the codes and the standards and things like that get updated, quite frequently. So, like this code that we're referring to here was updated in 2011. So that doesn't mean that the retaining wall section changed, but something about walls changed. So definitely it has changed over time, and what's more allowable and less allowable has changed over time. And then can it deteriorate over time? As in, was it a adequate retaining wall when it was constructed and now suddenly it's not adequate anymore? That can also happen. So especially, like, I mean, if it wasn't properly waterproofed or something like that, then your wall, the condition of your wall will deteriorate because there's moisture ingress and that starts corrosion of your rebar in a concrete wall and things like that. So then the structural integrity of that wall is compromised. And that's now not even looking at changing the conditions of, like what you said, is it now retaining more, or maybe somebody built a road now on top of, let's say you have this retaining wall, like, yeah. So there are two things that can change it, or a lot of things that can cause it to now not be adequate anymore. Let's say, for instance, first thing is, let's say your weep holes don't work anymore and your subsoil drainage doesn't work anymore. Then that will allow water to pond behind the wall. So now water will pond behind the wall, causing more pressure on the wall. So that can change it over time. So your weep holes being blocked and not working as they should. Then this can change. So that height can change. So that makes the wall inadequate then, because it wasn't retained for a higher retaining. Plus, what you can have is that people change whatever happens here on top. So let's say it was just earth, and now somebody has a driveway there. Then you have a load of cars and things going on there. So that also changes the design of that wall. And then lastly, like I mentioned before, the condition of this wall can deteriorate over time.
So, Philip, for the trustees who watch our channel, what do they need to look out for? So we all in sectional title, we need to have a 10-year maintenance plan, for example. Would a retaining wall form part of the maintenance that they need to do? What do they, as trustees, what do they look out for so that these retaining walls that they do have are maintained?
So look, you want to obviously have some sort of trigger point where you say, okay, we have a problem now with our wall, you know? So when you have to raise the alarm and contact somebody and say, look, we have an issue here. So typically when you see a crack, you know, when you see any form of crack on the wall, that's sort of an indication that something is happening there. It's not always necessarily that your wall is failing and it's going to collapse, but something is starting to happen. So there's some form of movement in your wall. So when you see a crack, when you see moisture in the wall, that is also, it's not necessarily an indication that the wall is failing. It might just be that they never waterproofed it, but that constant moisture in the wall will cause it to deteriorate over time, and then eventually in the future that wall will then become inadequate to retain what it was supposed to retain at the beginning. So in short, if you see a crack, that's a problem. If you see some moisture in it, you can contact somebody to have a look at it just to see that it doesn't affect the lifespan of your wall. And then to maintain your walls, it's difficult to maintain a retain, because I mean a lot of the things that's important for a retaining wall happens behind the retaining wall, underneath the earth. So it's difficult to maintain it, you know. So, but what you can do that will assist is just to make sure that those weep holes and the subsoil drainage is clean and things like that. So checking that weep hole there at the bottom, because they've got openings on the inside, but you can easily see and open and maybe take something out there that blocks it, because that will help.
Okay. Perfect. Thank you, Philip. I think we might end up having some more sessions about retaining walls and all the different types of walls that we can get. But I think this has been so helpful for our followers to understand the basics of retaining walls.
So yeah, perfect. I'm happy I could help, and I hope this was informative for everybody.
Yes, thank you very, very much.
All right.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.